In the heart of the American Dust Bowl, during the bleakest hours of the 1930s, the wind was the only constant traveler. It carried with it the topsoil of 1,000 ruined farms and the whispers of desperation. On one such evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in shades of rust and old blood, a solitary figure named Alistair Finch stumbled towards the only point of light for miles, Maude's Eats. The warmth spilling from its windows was a beacon in the desolate expanse. Inside, he was met with the overwhelming, almost heavenly aroma of roasting meat and spices. Presiding over this sanctuary was Maude, a widow whose gentle smile seemed to hold back the tide of the Great Depression itself. She slid a plate of her famous meatloaf in front of him, a portion so generous it felt like a prayer answered. Yet, as Finch looked up to thank her, he noticed her kind smile never quite managed to reach the cold, watchful stillness in her eyes. The meal was more than just food. It was a resurrection. For a man who had subsisted on little more than stale bread and bitter coffee for weeks, each bite of Maude's meatloaf was an indulgence bordering on the sacred. The texture was perfect, a firm yet tender loaf bound by breadcrumbs and a secret blend of herbs, all lacquered in a sweet, tangy tomato glaze that cut through the richness of the meat. It tasted of home, of a life before the dust storms had swallowed his world whole. Finch ate with a ravenousness that bordered on desperation, unaware that the very thing providing him with such profound comfort was, in fact, the final chapter in another man's forgotten story. He savored the meal, believing it to be the start of his good fortune, a turning point on a long and weary road. He could not have been more wrong. The flavor, so rich and complex, held a secret that was both unspeakable and unforgettable. Maude moved with a practiced grace, refilling coffee cups and offering warm words that felt as nourishing as her cooking. To the weary travelers and broken locals who filled her vinyl booths, she was a matriarch, a symbol of resilience in a world that had offered none. She spoke of faith, of community, of the importance of sharing what little one had. Her hands, though chapped and worn from labor, were gentle as she cleared plates, her voice a low and soothing hum against the crackle of the radio playing in the corner. She was the soul of the town, a living testament to the endurance of the human spirit. No one saw the pragmatism that lay beneath the piety, the cold calculus of a survivor who had learned the grim arithmetic of the harvest. Her charity was a carefully constructed facade, a baited trap set with a warm smile and a hot plate of food. When Alistair Finch finished his meal, he paid the small sum with what little he had, thanking Maude profusely for her kindness. She assured him it was her pleasure, offering him a place to rest in the back for the night before he continued his journey. He was tired. His belly was full for the first time in months, and the offer of a roof over his head felt like a deliverance. He followed her through a swinging door at the back of the kitchen, leaving the warm chatter of the diner behind. The door swung shut with a soft click, and Alistair Finch was never seen again. He simply vanished, another ghost absorbed by the vast, indifferent plains, his disappearance noted by no one. He became another name in a ledger no one knew existed, another ingredient in the cycle of lethal hospitality that kept Maude's Eats in business. Today, nearly a century later, the diner is nothing more than a skeleton. The roof has long since collapsed, its skeletal rafters open to the uncaring sky. The windows are vacant eyes, shattered by decades of neglect and the relentless prairie wind that now whistles a mournful tune through the decaying structure. The sign, Maude's Eats, hangs by a single rusted bolt, its cheerful red paint peeled away to reveal the rotting wood beneath. The air no longer carries the savory promise of her famous cooking. Instead, it is thick with the smell of dust, damp decay, and something else, a faint, lingering sweetness that clings to the ruins, a scent that locals swear grows stronger on moonless nights. The place is a monument to a forgotten horror, a permanent scar on the memory of the land, avoided by all who know its story. The story has curdled into a local legend, a piece of macabre folklore whispered by grandparents to frighten their grandchildren into behaving. They say the ground is cursed, that nothing will ever grow there again. They speak of phantom smells of cooking that drift from the ruins after midnight, a ghostly invitation to a final meal. Locals claim that on the quietest nights, you can hear the faint, rhythmic thud of a cleaver striking a butcher's block. echoing from the collapsed root cellar where the town's darkest secret was once meticulously prepared and served with a smile. It has become a place of grim pilgrimage for those fascinated by the grotesque, a physical manifestation of how hunger, in its most extreme form, can pervert the most basic acts of human kindness into something utterly monstrous and predatory. The legend is an echo that endures to this day, a testament to a darkness that took root in a time of profound scarcity. And since these stories travel through time, carried on whispers and warnings, tell us in the comments what city you're joining us from for this investigation, and the exact time on your clock. With your presence now marked in our own records, we can return to the late 1930s, to a time when Maude was still the town's beloved matriarch, and uncover how the first subtle crack appeared in her perfect, charitable facade. The arrival of Deputy Samuel Miller in the autumn of 1937 was a quiet affair, barely registering against the persistent whisper of the prairie wind. Transferred from the cacophony and grime of Chicago, he was a man seeking order in an era defined by chaos. His methodical nature and the haunted look in his eyes spoke of a past spent witnessing the worst of human desperation, a grim education that had stripped him of any illusions about the world. To him, this desolate town, with its single dusty main street and its veneer of pious tranquility, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a place where secrets could fester undisturbed. The locals spoke of one beacon of hope in their bleak existence, Maude's Eats, a place they described not as a diner, but as the very heart of their community, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Miller, however, had learned that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows, and he reserved his judgment. His new office was little more than a closet, filled with the stale smell of old paper and forgotten justice. His predecessor, a man content to let the Depression's tide of misery wash over the town without interference, had left behind a legacy of neglect. Miller began the painstaking process of reviewing the old files, his sharp mind seeking patterns where the former sheriff had seen only the random misfortunes of hard times. Each brittle page told a story of quiet desperation, foreclosures, petty thefts, domestic disputes born of hunger and fear. But beneath this surface layer of predictable hardship, another, more unsettling narrative began to take shape, written in the faint ink of reports that had been filed and promptly ignored. It was a chronicle of absence, a quiet ledger of men who had simply ceased to be. The pattern was subtle at first, easily dismissed. A series of missing person inquiries, logged over several years. A migrant worker from Oklahoma, a salesman from St. Louis, a young man heading west to seek his fortune. The previous lawman's notes were always the same: moved on, or likely hopped a train. In an era where millions were displaced, it was a logical conclusion. Men vanished all the time. But Miller, with his big city perspective on crime statistics, saw an improbability. For a town of this size, so isolated from major thoroughfares, the number of individuals who had last been seen here before disappearing was disproportionately high. It was a statistical anomaly that felt less like coincidence and more like a carefully concealed equation. The town's silence on the matter was not peaceful. It was heavy, weighted with unspoken knowledge, drawn by its reputation as much as his own nascent suspicion. Deputy Miller paid his first visit to Maude's Eats. The moment he stepped inside, he was enveloped by a wave of warmth and the rich, almost intoxicating aroma of roasting meat and baked bread. It was a scent that promised safety and sustenance, a powerful anesthetic against the harsh realities outside. And there, at the center of it all, was Maude. Her smile was genuine, her movements efficient yet graceful as she served him a generous portion of her legendary meatloaf. She spoke of faith and resilience, her voice a soothing balm. To Miller, a man accustomed to calculating duplicity, her kindness felt both profound and deeply unsettling. He ate the meal, acknowledging its perfection, while a cold knot of professional instinct tightened in his gut. He became a regular observer of the diner's daily rhythm, watching the intricate dance of charity and commerce. He saw the locals who revered Maude as a saint, their faces softening in her presence. He saw the weary travelers, their guards lowered by the promise of a hot meal and a compassionate ear. And he saw Silas, Maude's dishwasher. The young man was simple-minded, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze perpetually fixed on the floor. He functioned with a skittish devotion, a silent acolyte to Maude's public ministry of kindness. He polished silverware until it gleamed and scrubbed floors with a frantic energy. His loyalty so absolute it bordered on fear. Silas never spoke, but his presence was a constant, quiet hum in the background of the diner's cheerful noise, a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony of communal harmony. The first tangible crack in the facade appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. Miller was making his rounds when he saw Silas behind the diner, meticulously cleaning his fingernails with a small, ornate pocket knife. The object immediately caught Miller's eye. Its handle was crafted from mother of pearl, shimmering in the dull afternoon light. It was an item of quality and expense, utterly incongruous with the meager possessions of a dishwasher in the depths of the Great Depression. It was a gentleman's tool, the kind a successful traveling salesman might carry to trim a cigar or open a letter. A cold certainty began to crystallize in Miller's mind. This was not just a knife. It was evidence, a misplaced artifact from a story that had ended abruptly and violently. The quiet hum of wrongness he had sensed in the town files had just become a clear, piercing tone. Miller approached Silas, his voice calm and non-threatening, and asked about the knife. The young man's reaction was immediate and telling. Panic flared in his wide eyes, and he began to stammer, incoherent words tumbling from his lips as he looked desperately toward the diner's back door. As if summoned by his silent plea, Maude emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile was as warm and placid as ever, but it did not reach the cold, watchful stillness in her eyes. She placed a gentle, proprietary hand on Silas's shoulder and explained with effortless poise that the boy had simply found the pretty little thing on the roadside a few weeks back. It was a stroke of luck, she cooed, a small gift from the Lord in trying times. Her explanation was a perfectly constructed wall of plausibility, designed to deflect any further inquiry. Though he projected calm, Miller's instincts screamed that he was being lied to. He confiscated the knife, citing official procedure for found property, ignoring Maude's gentle protestations. Back in the solitude of his office, the pearl handle felt cold and heavy in his hand, a tangible link to a ghost. He spread out the missing person files, his gaze scanning the faded typewritten descriptions, and then he found it, the report on Arthur Penhaligon, a purveyor of farming equipment from Kansas City, who had vanished 8 months ago. His wife's detailed inventory of his personal effects included a specific, heartbreaking mention: a pearl-handled pocket knife, a 25th anniversary gift, engraved with his initials. The letters A.P. were faintly visible on the silver bolster. It was no longer a coincidence, it was a confirmation. The discovery irrevocably altered Miller's perception of the town. The comforting aroma of Maude's cooking that wafted through the streets now seemed cloying, a sweet, deceptive perfume designed to mask an underlying rot. The cheerful chatter from the diner no longer sounded like community. It sounded like the oblivious chorus in a tragedy. Maude's public persona, the devout widow, the tireless caregiver, the town's matriarch, now seemed like a masterful performance. Every act of charity, every prayerful utterance, was recast in a sinister new light. He realized he was not policing a town suffering from the Depression, but a hunting ground meticulously managed by a predator who had perfected the camouflage of kindness. The question was no longer if something was wrong, but how deep the horror truly went. He began a discreet, almost obsessive surveillance. He sat in his car across the street, watching the ebb and flow of humanity through the diner's doors. He paid special attention to the solitary travelers, the ones whose faces were etched with loneliness and fatigue, the ones who clearly had no family waiting for them down the road. He watched them accept Maude's hospitality, saw the relief wash over them as she offered a warm meal and, often, a place to rest for the night in a back room. He logged their descriptions in his private notebook: the tall man in the worn-out coat, the young man with the guitar case, and with a growing, sickening certainty, he noted that after they passed through the swinging door at the back of Maude's kitchen, they were never, ever seen again. The pattern was alive, and the harvest was ongoing. The fragile equilibrium of the town was shattered not by a dust storm, but by the sputtering arrival of a Ford Model A. It rolled to a stop in front of the sheriff's office, its black paint coated in a uniform layer of ochre dust. a clear testament to a long and arduous journey. From within emerged a family, a man, a woman, and their teenage son, their clothes worn but clean, their faces etched not with the familiar desperation of the dispossessed, but with an implacable, focused resolve. They were not seeking charity or a place to rest. They were seeking answers. Their presence was an anomaly, a foreign object introduced into a closed system, and their arrival marked the moment a quiet, statistical curiosity would begin its transformation into a public and dangerous inquisition. For Deputy Miller, watching from his window, it felt like the first tremor before an earthquake. Inside the cramped office, Eleanor Henderson placed a worn photograph on Miller's desk. The image was of a smiling, well-dressed man in his late 40s, his eyes crinkling with a good-natured confidence. This was her brother, Arthur Penhaligon. Eleanor spoke with a clarity that cut through the stuffy air, her voice devoid of hysteria but weighted with an unyielding certainty. Her brother was a creature of habit, a man who lived by the clock and the calendar. He was supposed to have arrived in Sacramento 3 weeks prior. His last letter, a cheerful note detailing his sales route through the Panhandle, was postmarked from this very town. She looked at Miller, her gaze direct and challenging, making it clear that the vague, dismissive explanations that satisfied the transient and the forgotten would not suffice for her. She had come for her brother, and she would not leave without him. Miller felt a familiar coldness seep into his bones as he retrieved the pearl-handled knife from his desk drawer. He listened as Eleanor described her brother's personal effects, her voice catching for the first time as she mentioned the anniversary gift she and her husband had given him. The description matched the object in his possession perfectly, down to the small chip on the edge of the pearl inlay. The flimsy wall of coincidence Maude had constructed now lay in ruins. This was no longer a case of a drifter who moved on. This was a tangible connection, a piece of a man's life left behind like a tombstone. The family's grief was a powerful, clarifying force, transforming a file of abstract disappearances into a singular, urgent tragedy. The town's heavy silence suddenly felt less like peace and more like a conspiracy. Forced by the family's unwavering persistence, Miller knew his discreet surveillance was over. This was now an official investigation, and it would have to begin at the heart of the community, Maude's Eats. He walked with the Hendersons down the dusty main street, the afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows before them. The savory aroma of roasting meat, which usually offered a comforting promise of sustenance, now seemed predatory and cloying. As they approached the diner, the cheerful sounds of conversation and clinking silverware spilling from its open door felt like a grotesque mockery. Every local who tipped their hat to Miller seemed to be watching him, their eyes holding a shared, unspoken warning. He was no longer just the new deputy. He was an outsider about to commit an act of profound sacrilege by questioning their saint. The moment they entered, a hush fell over the diner. Maude turned from the counter, her smile of welcome faltering for a fraction of a second as she saw Miller and the severe-faced strangers accompanying him. He presented the photograph of Arthur Penhaligon. Maude studied it, her expression a perfect mask of thoughtful concern. She claimed to see so many faces, so many weary travelers, that they all tended to blur together. It was a masterful evasion, delivered with a gentle, apologetic tone that invited sympathy. She was just a humble woman trying to help. Her demeanor suggested, how could she possibly be expected to remember every single soul who passed through her doors? She looked from Miller to Eleanor, her eyes radiating a placid kindness that was as impenetrable as tempered steel. But Eleanor Henderson was immune to the performance. He had an argument here, she stated, her voice cutting through the diner's sudden silence. My brother was a loud man when he felt he was being cheated. The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy. Maude's smile tightened. She began a soft-spoken denial, but it was too late. An old farmer in a corner booth, his face a roadmap of sun and hardship, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat and, avoiding Maude's gaze, mumbled that he did recall a salesman, a big talker, raising a fuss about the price of a room out back a few months ago. He remembered it because nobody ever argued with Maude. The admission, reluctant as it was a cannon shot through the carefully constructed narrative of the diner's perfect harmony. Maude's composure was formidable. She turned the farmer's confession to her advantage with breathtaking speed. Her eyes welled with practiced tears as she explained that the poor man had been agitated and unwell. She had offered him a meal and a place to rest out of Christian charity, she explained, and he had repaid her kindness with accusations and anger before storming out into the night. She portrayed herself as the long-suffering benefactor, her generosity thrown back in her face. The patrons of the diner, her loyal flock, murmured their support, their expressions hardening as they looked at the outsiders who had dared to upset their matriarch. In a matter of seconds, she had transformed herself from a potential suspect into a victim, and Arthur Penhaligon from a missing person into an ungrateful transient. The Hendersons left the diner in a state of frustrated disbelief, their certainty shaken by Maude's flawless performance and the town's unified front against them. They had come with a clear purpose and were leaving with nothing but a skillfully crafted story designed to send them away. To them, it seemed the investigation had hit a dead end, stonewalled by a community enthralled to its beloved caregiver. They saw only a wall of silence and devotion, a town so desperate for a symbol of hope that it was willing to overlook any inconsistency to protect her. They could not see the crucial cracks that had just formed in the foundation of Maude's benevolent empire, cracks that were visible only to the trained, suspicious eyes of Deputy Samuel Miller. Miller, however, had seen everything he needed to see. He had seen the flicker of recognition in Maude's eyes when she first saw the photograph. He had heard the farmer's reluctant corroboration of an argument. Most importantly, he had witnessed the sheer, calculated artistry of her deception. Her ability to manipulate the emotions of the entire room was not the reaction of an innocent woman wrongly accused. It was the practiced skill of a predator protecting its hunting ground. The lie about the knife was the cornerstone of his suspicion, and the public confrontation had now added 2 more layers of evidence, a confirmed presence and a demonstrable, public lie about the nature of that presence. The game had changed. The incident served as a declaration of war. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side stood Maude, shielded by the fierce, almost fanatical loyalty of a town that depended on her for both physical and spiritual nourishment. On the other stood Deputy Miller, a solitary agent of objective truth, now openly challenging the foundational myth of their collective survival. He knew that any further investigation would be met with resistance, obstruction, and hostility. The town's veneer of quiet desperation had been stripped away, revealing an active, protective conspiracy. He was no longer just looking for a missing man. He was prying into a secret the entire community was desperate, and perhaps even willing to kill, to keep buried. With the Hendersons gone, a suffocating quiet descended upon the town, but it was not a quiet of peace. It was the tense, watchful silence of a predator's den that has been disturbed. Deputy Miller felt the shift immediately. Eyes followed him from behind drawn curtains, and conversations in the general store would cease the moment he entered. The air, once thick with the aroma of Maude's cooking, now felt heavy with a collective, unspoken hostility. He was no longer a curiosity. He was a threat to the fragile ecosystem of survival they had built around their matriarch. Miller understood that his investigation could no longer rely on cooperation. He would have to dissect the town's secrets piece by piece, starting with the mundane logistics that underpinned every disappearance. He decided his next visit would be to the town's only other lodging establishment, the Prairie Rest boarding house, a place where many of the vanished had spent their first and last night. The boarding house was a skeletal structure run by a man named Elias Thorne, whose perpetually nervous disposition seemed etched onto his face by the prairie wind itself. The place smelled of mothballs and stale coffee, a stark, antiseptic contrast to the rich, inviting scent that perpetually emanated from Maude's eats down the street. When Miller began his questioning, Thorne's hands trembled as he polished an already clean water glass. He confirmed that yes, he remembered Arthur Penhaligon. He remembered several of the men from the missing person files. They were good tenants, he stammered. Quiet men who paid on time. They would stay a night, maybe 2, and then they would be gone. Most, he added with a deliberate lack of eye contact, spent their evenings at Maude's. He spoke of her diner not as a restaurant, but as a siren's call of warmth and community in a cold, desolate world. Miller, sensing the man's profound fear, pressed for something more concrete than vague recollections. He asked for the guest register, a formal request that made Thorne flinch as if struck. The man protested, claiming it was private. But the deputy's quiet insistence was unyielding. Thorne finally retrieved a heavy, leather-bound ledger from under the front desk, its pages brittle with age. Miller spent the next 2 hours in the dim light of the lobby, painstakingly cross-referencing the names and dates in the register with the grim list in his own notebook. The correlation was sickeningly perfect. Every man who had vanished from the county over the last 5 years had a corresponding entry in Thorne's book. Their signatures, full of the hope or weariness of the road, were the last official record of their existence. The Prairie Rest boarding house was not a destination. It was a waiting room. The guest register confirmed their presence, but it didn't explain their absence. Miller shifted his line of questioning from people to commerce, asking Thorne about the suppliers and delivery services that served the isolated town. Who brought in the flour, the sugar, the meat? Thorne became even more evasive, claiming he minded his own business. But Miller's gaze was relentless. He explained, in a cold and factual tone, the legal definition of being an accessory to a crime. The color drained from Thorne's face. With a shaking hand, he produced another set of books, the ledgers detailing every delivery, every transaction, every commercial link to the outside world. He told Miller to look for the entries from Black Creek Provisions, a supplier from a neighboring county that made weekly runs. It was here, buried in columns of mundane expenses, that the investigation took a pivotal turn. The Black Creek Provisions ledger was a meticulous record of the town's sustenance, a testament to its reliance on the outside world. Miller's finger traced the columns of entries: 50-pound sacks of flour for the general store, barrels of salted fish, crates of tinned goods. Then he found the section for Maude's Eats. The entries were initially predictable: sugar, coffee, spices, lard. But beginning 3 years ago, a new, recurring item appeared, an order that was both specific and unnervingly regular. Every few weeks, coinciding almost exactly with the day after a solitary traveler checked out of Thorne's boarding house and was never seen again, Maude would sign for a special delivery. The ledger entry was always the same: 50 pounds of ice, 10 pounds of curing salt, and 1 roll of heavy-duty waxed butcher's paper. These were not the ingredients for a meal. They were the tools of a mortician. Miller looked up from the ledger, the cold truth of the entry settling in his gut like a stone. He wasn't looking at a record of supplies. He was looking at a chronicle of slaughter: the ice to retard decomposition, the salt to cure and preserve, the thick waxed paper to wrap the results. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. It was a procedural checklist. A man would arrive in town, check into the boarding house, eat his final meal at Maude's, and then vanish. The following day, Maude would receive her kit, the necessary implements to process her grim harvest. She wasn't just the town's cook. She was its abattoir. The comforting, savory aroma that defined the town was not the smell of home cooking. It was the smell of a meticulously managed, human-based food chain, and the entire town was breathing it in every single day. He presented the ledger to Elias Thorne, placing his finger on one of the damning entries dated the day after Arthur Penhaligon's disappearance. "Explain this, Elias," Miller said, his voice low and dangerous. The boarding house owner finally broke. Sobs racked his thin frame as a torrent of confession spilled out. He admitted that Maude paid him handsomely for his silence. She used his boarding house as a vetting station, a place to identify the lonely, the forgotten, the men whose absence would create no ripples. He confessed that on several occasions, his truck had been borrowed in the dead of night. He was instructed to leave the keys on the dash and ask no questions. The next morning, the truck would be returned, the cargo bed swept clean, but always smelling faintly of bleach and something else, something metallic and sweet. Thorne's confession painted a chilling portrait of Maude's influence. She was not merely a killer. She was a master of psychological control. He recounted how, after Miller's first inquiries, Maude had paid him a visit. She had not threatened him with violence. Her methods were far more insidious. She brought his children sweets from her kitchen, complimented his wife on her garden, and then, with her arm around his shoulders, she reminded him how fragile everything was in these hard times. A business could fail, a family could starve, a fire could start from a faulty wire. She spoke of the Lord's will and the importance of community loyalty, her gentle voice weaving a tapestry of veiled threats that left him paralyzed with fear. She had inoculated the entire town with her brand of coercive kindness, ensuring that silence was the price of survival. Armed with Thorne's terrified confession and the ledger, Miller knew he was close, but he still lacked the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. A confession extracted from a frightened man and a list of supplies were not enough to convict a saint. As if sensing his progress, Maude began her counteroffensive, a masterful campaign of public relations designed to isolate Miller completely. She organized a town-wide prayer vigil for the poor and the hungry, standing before the congregation and speaking with tear-filled eyes about the importance of faith in the face of hardship and the evil of outsiders who sought to sow division and doubt. She presented herself as a martyr, a simple, godly woman being persecuted by a cold, cynical lawman who couldn't comprehend their way of life. The town, desperate for a hero, rallied around her with a renewed, almost fanatical fervor. Her charity became more conspicuous than ever. She delivered baskets of food to families on the brink of foreclosure, her famous meatloaf and fresh-baked bread appearing on their doorsteps like a miracle. Every act of kindness was a calculated move, a reinforcement of her narrative and a further indictment of the man investigating her. The locals who had once offered Miller a hesitant nod now turned their backs on him. Children were hurried inside as he passed. The owner of the general store suddenly claimed he was out of stock of the coffee brand Miller drank. He was an outcast, a pariah in a town that had closed ranks to protect its monstrous secret. He was a man trying to solve a murder in a village where the killer was the most beloved citizen, and every other resident was a potential accomplice. The psychological pressure was immense. Miller found himself working in complete isolation, the weight of the town's collective denial pressing in on him. He would sit in his office late into the night, the missing person files spread across his desk, the faces of the vanished men staring up at him. He could hear the distant, cheerful music from the radio at Maude's Eats, a sound that now seemed grotesque and mocking. The scent of her cooking, a permanent feature of the town's atmosphere, seeped through the window frames, a constant, cloying reminder of the horror he was trying to unearth. He was fighting not just a single perpetrator, but an entire community's will to believe in a beautiful lie, a lie that was served hot on a plate every single day. He began to focus his surveillance on the physical structure of the diner itself. From his car parked across the street, he would watch for hours, mapping the building's routines. He noted the deliveries, the departure of the last customers. The moment the lights in the main dining room went out, he paid particular attention to Silas, the dishwasher. The young man's routine was unvarying, except for one detail. Late at night, long after the diner was closed, Miller would see Silas emerge from the back, not to go home, but to haul heavy buckets of water to a large reinforced door set into the ground behind the kitchen. It was the entrance to the root cellar. The door was secured with a thick, new-looking padlock, far more robust than necessary for storing potatoes and preserves. The root cellar became the focal point of Miller's obsession. It was the one part of Maude's operation that was explicitly hidden from public view, the one place where the facade of the benevolent matriarch was physically separated from the mechanics of her true enterprise. He reviewed the original building plans for the property at the county clerk's office. They showed a simple, dirt-floored cellar for storing vegetables, but Thorne's confession about the bleach and the late-night activities of Silas suggested it had been renovated. It was a subterranean space, a blind spot in the town's daily life. Miller felt a cold certainty that whatever secrets Maude kept, their physical manifestation, the very heart of her darkness, lay buried beneath that heavily padlocked door. His investigation had reached a critical impasse. He had a clear pattern, a terrified witnessing and strong circumstantial evidence, but Maude remained untouchable, shielded by her own cunning and the town's desperate loyalty. He knew that confronting her directly again would be fruitless. She would simply deploy her well-rehearsed performance of the wounded benefactor. The town would believe her. Any attempt to question Silas would be equally useless, as the boy was too terrified and devoted to betray his mistress. To break the case, he needed to get inside that cellar. He needed physical proof, something so undeniable it would shatter the myth of Maude and force the town to confront the unspeakable truth they had chosen to ignore. He began the arduous process of preparing an affidavit for a search warrant. In the oppressive silence of his office, he meticulously documented every piece of his investigation. He listed the names of the 19 men who had disappeared. He detailed the discovery of Arthur Penhaligon's pearl-handled knife. He transcribed the damning entries from the Black Creek provisions ledger, highlighting the chilling correlation between the disappearances and Maude's purchases of ice, salt, and butcher's paper. He included a sworn, though anonymous, summary of Elias Thorne's confession, detailing the late-night use of his truck and Maude's campaign of intimidation. He described his own surveillance, noting the fortified cellar door and Silas's nocturnal cleaning rituals. He knew the request was a monumental gamble. He would be asking Judge Albright, a man who had lunch at Maude's Eats 3 times a week, to sign a warrant authorizing him to break into the establishment of the town's most revered citizen. It was an accusation of such monstrous proportions that it bordered on the insane. If he was wrong, his career would be over, and he would be driven out of the county in disgrace. But if he was right, he would be exposing a horror that would not only destroy a woman, but would also tear the soul out of the entire community, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. The town's identity was inextricably linked to Maude's kindness. To prove she was a monster was to prove that their own survival was built upon a foundation of cannibalism. The intimidation escalated. One morning, Miller awoke to find a dead crow laid carefully on the hood of his Ford, a clear and unambiguous warning. His mail consisted of anonymous letters filled with scripture verses about false witness and the wrath of God. During his patrols, he would find the road blocked by a fallen tree or a piece of abandoned farm equipment, small acts of obstruction designed to impede and demoralize him. It was a low-grade, persistent campaign of psychological warfare orchestrated by Maude, who never had to lift a finger herself. Her devoted flock was more than willing to do her bidding, protecting their saint from the blasphemous outsider who dared to question her divinity. The town was no longer just a location, it was an active antagonist in his investigation. Miller's isolation was now absolute. He was a solitary agent of truth in a land that had chosen to embrace a comforting and savage lie. He ate canned food in his small apartment, the thought of consuming any locally prepared meal now impossible. Every smiling face he passed on the street felt like a mask. Every polite greeting a veiled threat. The very air he breathed, saturated with the sweet, savory scent of Maude's kitchen, felt like a poison. He understood now that the disappearances were not a secret the town was keeping. They were a sacrament. Maude was feeding them, body and soul, and in return, they had given her their complete, unshakable, and terrifying devotion. His search warrant was no longer just a legal document, it was an act of exorcism. Judge Albright looked at the affidavit as if it were a venomous snake, his face pale in the dim light of his chambers. He was a man who had built his career on maintaining the town's fragile peace, and Deputy Miller was asking him to detonate a bomb at its very center. The judge read through the document twice, his finger tracing the names of the missing, the description of the pearl-handled knife, and the damning entries in the provisioner's ledger. He muttered about the lack of a body, the flimsiness of circumstantial evidence, the public outcry. But Miller stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. He pointed to the 19 names, a quiet litany of the vanished, and asked the judge how many more entries the town was willing to add to that list before they dared to look in the cellar. With a trembling hand that betrayed his profound reluctance, Albright signed the warrant, an act that felt less like justice and more like signing the town's death certificate. The raid was scheduled for dawn, a time when the prairie was caught between the darkness of night and the harsh light of day. Miller, accompanied by 2 nervous deputies he had summoned from the county seat, drove down the silent main street. As they pulled up to the diner, it seemed the entire town was already awake. Figures stood in doorways and peered from behind curtains, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. They were a silent, hostile jury, gathered to witness either the vindication of their saint or the confirmation of a horror they had subconsciously refused to acknowledge. The savory aroma of Maude's kitchen was absent for the first time in years. The morning air was cold, clean, and heavy with an unbearable tension. The moment of truth, for better or for worse, had finally arrived. They found Maude in her kitchen, humming a hymn as she methodically kneaded a large mound of bread dough, her hands dusted with flour. She looked up as Miller entered, her expression one of serene, grandmotherly concern. When he presented the search warrant, she showed no surprise, no anger, only a deep, theatrical sadness. She wiped her hands on her apron and spoke of the Lord's tests, of how good people are often persecuted by a world that does not understand faith. She told him he was making a terrible mistake, but that she would pray for his soul nonetheless. Her performance was flawless, a final, defiant act of public piety designed to make the lawmen feel like blasphemers desecrating a holy place. She then stepped aside, gesturing with an open palm toward the back of the kitchen as if inviting them to witness their own folly. The root cellar door was exactly as Miller had observed, thick oak, reinforced with iron straps, and secured by a heavy modern padlock that was utterly out of place. One of the deputies, a burly man who had been visibly uneasy, took a crowbar to the hasp. The sound of splintering wood and screeching metal echoed through the quiet kitchen, a violent and definitive violation of the diner's peaceful facade. With the lock broken, Miller pulled the heavy door open, revealing a steep, narrow set of stone steps descending into a profound darkness. A wave of cold air washed over them, carrying with it a sterile, chemical scent of bleach so strong it stung the eyes. Beneath that antiseptic surface, however, was another, fainter odor, a cloying, coppery sweetness that clung to the back of the throat, the unmistakable smell of old blood. As their lanterns cut through the gloom, the scene that unfolded was one of sterile, meticulous horror. The cellar was not the dirt-floored storage space from the building plans. It had been completely transformed. The floor was smooth, poured concrete, angled slightly toward a large, grated drain in the center. The stone walls had been scrubbed clean, and hanging from thick iron hooks bolted into the ceiling were gleaming chains and pulleys. In the middle of the room stood a massive, heavily scarred butcher's block, its surface bleached to an almost luminous white but stained with dark, indelible patterns that had soaked deep into the grain of the wood. It was not a pantry. It was an abattoir, a disassembly line designed for the efficient and sanitary processing of flesh, and it was immaculately, terrifyingly clean. The deputies began their search with a grim, methodical silence, their initial reluctance replaced by a dawning, sickening understanding. They tapped the walls, sounded the floor, and inspected the drains. It was Miller who noticed it, a section of the stone wall near the back where the mortar seemed newer, the color slightly off from the surrounding stones. Using the end of the crowbar, he pried at a loose rock. It gave way, revealing not dirt and earth, but a dark, hollow space within the wall. Reaching inside, his fingers brushed against cold leather. He pulled out the object, a man's wallet, its contents still intact. Inside was a driver's license bearing the smiling, confident face of Arthur Penhaligon. They had found their proof. The hidden compartment was a tomb of forgotten lives. One by one, they removed the contents, laying them out on a clean cloth on the concrete floor. There were more wallets, 19 in total. A tarnished silver locket containing a faded picture of a woman and child. A set of spectacles with one lens cracked. A pearl-handled pocket knife, identical to the one found on Silas. A collection of wedding rings, their inscriptions worn smooth. A folded, tear-stained letter from a mother to her son, wishing him luck on his journey west. Each item was a silent testament to a life cut short, a story that had ended abruptly on Maude's butcher's block. The sheer volume of personal effects transformed the investigation from a search for a single man into an excavation of a mass grave, a museum of the consumed. But the most damning piece of evidence was the last thing they found, tucked away at the very back of the secret compartment. It was a simple, cloth-bound accounting ledger, identical to the ones used by shopkeepers across the country. Its cover was neatly labeled in a prim, feminine script, Maude's Kitchen Recipes. Miller opened it, his hands unsteady for the first time. The first few pages contained ordinary recipes, listing ingredients for apple pie, sourdough starter, and buttermilk biscuits. But then the entries began to change. He turned a page and saw the heading for her famous meatloaf. The list of ingredients was chillingly familiar. Breadcrumbs, onions, tomato glaze, a blend of herbs, and then a final, horrifying entry. It was not an ingredient. It was a name. The ledger was a meticulous, unemotional chronicle of her crimes, a fusion of culinary art and cannibalistic bookkeeping. Beside each man's name, Arthur Penhaligon, John Samples, Peter Hobbs, she had made brief, pragmatic notes as if cataloging livestock. A. P. Approx. 180 lily bees, good marbling, a bit sinewy. Another entry noted, J.S., lean but tender, low yield. She recorded the dates they arrived and the dates they were processed. The names from Miller's missing person files were all there, reduced to cold, culinary assessments. The book was the ultimate perversion, transforming human beings into mere components, their lives and identities rendered down into nothing more than an entry in a recipe for the dish that had made her a local legend. The savory aroma that had defined the town was the ghost of these men. They brought the ledger upstairs. Maude was sitting at one of the diner's booths, her hands folded calmly in her lap, a Bible open on the table before her. She looked at the recipe book in Miller's hand, and for the first time, her placid mask seemed to crack, not with fear or remorse, but with a flicker of what looked like professional pride. She did not deny it. Her confession, later recorded in Miller's official report, was delivered in the same calm, practical tone she might use to describe how to properly render lard. She explained that the depression had taken everything from her: her husband, her farm, her future. The world had become a place of waste, where good men starved while others had more than they needed. She had simply found a way to correct the imbalance. She saw her actions not as murder, but as a form of grim, sustainable agriculture. "The Lord provides the harvest," she stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "It is not for us to question its form. A man with no family, no one to miss him, to let him simply pass on is a waste. He has something left to give." She explained her system with chilling clarity. The lonely travelers were the fallow deer, and her kitchen was simply a place where nothing was put to waste. She fed the hungry, provided for her community, and maintained a perfect closed loop of consumption. In her mind, she was not a monster. She was a survivor, a pragmatist who had looked into the abyss of starvation and had found a solution that was both practical and, in her twisted view, profoundly just. Her confession hung in the air of the cheerful diner, a statement of such monstrous logic that it defied all reason. She spoke of her victims with a complete lack of malice, discussing their final moments with the detached air of a farmer describing the slaughter of a pig. She had offered them a final moment of warmth and kindness, a good meal and a gentle word, before they served their ultimate purpose. To her, this was an act of mercy, a final contribution to the world that had forgotten them. The kindness was not a facade for the horror. In her mind, it was an integral part of it. The act of lethal hospitality was her life's work, a testament to her refusal to be broken by a world that had tried to starve her into submission. As the deputies led her away in handcuffs, a crowd of townspeople watched in stunned, horrified silence. The woman they had revered as a saint, the matriarch who had sustained them through the hardest of times, was a cannibal. The meatloaf they had eaten with such gratitude, the meal she had so generously provided to their children, were the remains of forgotten men. The realization washed over them not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping poison, tainting every memory of her kindness, every savory meal, every prayer she had ever uttered. They were not just witnesses to her crimes. They were unwitting participants, their survival inextricably linked to her slaughterhouse. The foundation of their community had not been faith and resilience. It had been human flesh. The diner was sealed, becoming an instant monument to the town's shame. Word of Maude's eats spread like a prairie fire, transforming the small, forgotten town into a national symbol of Great Depression horror. Reporters and morbid tourists descended upon the community, eager to gaze upon the place where the unthinkable had happened. The townspeople, once united in their devotion to Maude, were now united in their shared trauma and disgrace. They had been sustained by a monster, and the knowledge of what they had consumed, both literally and figuratively, would become a permanent, indigestible part of their collective identity, a stain that no amount of time or distance could ever wash away. The harvest was finally over, but its bitter legacy was just beginning to take root. The trial of Maude was not a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle. Newspapers from coast to coast dubbed her the Dust Bowl cannibal, her placid, grandmotherly face staring out from front pages, a chilling juxtaposition against headlines detailing the gruesome contents of her recipe ledger. Throughout the proceedings, she remained a figure of inscrutable calm, her composure never breaking. She listened to the damning testimony of Deputy Miller and the forensic analysis of the items found in her cellar with the mild interest of a parishioner listening to a sermon. When asked to account for her actions, she spoke not of madness or malice, but of providence and pragmatism. She described her harvest with the same unemotional detail she had used in her ledger, turning the courtroom into a silent, horrified classroom for her own brutal philosophy of survival. Her lack of remorse was her most terrifying attribute. She was not a monster who had lost her humanity, but one who had redefined it. Her conviction was a foregone conclusion, the evidence irrefutable, and the confession absolute. The jury, composed of faces hardened by the same depression that had forged Maude, delivered its guilty verdict on 19 counts of murder without a moment of hesitation. Yet, as the judge sentenced her to life in prison, a sentence she received with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, no sense of justice settled over the courtroom. Her final statement, read from a slip of paper she retrieved from her pocket, was a perversely chosen verse from the book of Proverbs. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. In her mind, she was not a sinner condemned, but a matriarch misunderstood, a provider whose methods were simply a reflection of the savage world she inhabited. She was led away, leaving behind not closure, but a permanent, unanswerable question about the dark necessities of a desperate time. For the town, Maude's conviction was the beginning of an agony far worse than the trial itself. The community's identity, once built on the comforting myth of her charity, was now irrevocably fused with the horror of her crimes. Neighbors who had once shared her meatloaf at church potlucks now looked at each other with a shared, unspoken sickness. Every act of kindness she had ever shown was retroactively poisoned, every memory tainted. The town became a pariah, its name a punchline in a macabre national joke. Mail was returned, deliveries were refused, and travelers would speed past the town limits, their windows rolled up tight as if the very air was contaminated. The silence that fell over the dusty main street was no longer one of peace, but of profound and incurable shame. They had been fed and sustained by the dead, and the knowledge was a poison in their collective bloodstream. The slow death of the town began almost immediately. Within a year, a third of the families had packed their meager belongings and vanished in the night, unable to bear the weight of their new reputation. The general store, its business crippled, shuttered its windows. The Prairie Rest boarding house, now a monument to a grim waiting room, was abandoned by Elias Thorne, who was last seen walking east along the railroad tracks, a ghost haunted by his own silence. The school's population dwindled until it was no longer viable. The town was withering, not from the dust storms that had once threatened it, but from a rot that had started from within its very heart. Maude's eats, the source of their sustenance, had become the source of their destruction, and the community she claimed to have saved was now dying because of her. The individuals who had orbited Maude's dark star were cast into their own private hells. Deputy Samuel Miller, the man who had unearthed the truth, found he could no longer live there. He saw the faces of the 19 victims in the eyes of every resident, their silent accusation a constant presence. He requested a transfer and left as quietly as he had arrived, forever marked by the case that had proven his darkest instincts about the world to be true. Silas, Maude's simple-minded acolyte, was sent to a state asylum, his mind shattered by the horrors he had been forced to witness and participate in. He spent his days scrubbing the floors of his small room, his hands raw, forever trying to wash away stains that only he could see, his silence now absolute and eternal. The human cost of Maude's harvest extended far beyond her butcher's block. The diner itself was condemned, not by law, but by superstition. No one dared to tear it down, fearing to disturb the profound evil that had soaked into its very foundations. It was left to the elements, a skeletal monument to an unspeakable chapter of American history. The cheerful red paint peeled away, revealing wood, the color of old bone. The prairie wind, which once carried the savory scent of roasting meat, now whistled a mournful dirge through its shattered windows. The sign, Maude's Eats, hung by a single rusted hinge for years, creaking back and forth like a gallows go, before finally crashing to the ground during a violent thunderstorm, an event the locals took as a final, angry sigh from the cursed land itself. The building became a physical manifestation of the town's trauma, a place of profound and permanent decay. Over the decades, fact curdled into folklore. The story of Maude became a cautionary tale whispered to frighten children, a piece of macabre local mythology. It was said that the land around the diner was soured, that nothing would ever grow there again. Locals swore that on still, moonless nights, you could still smell the phantom aroma of her infamous meatloaf drifting from the ruins, a ghostly invitation to a final meal. Others claimed to hear the faint rhythmic thud of a cleaver on a butcher's block echoing from the collapsed root cellar, the sound of a harvest that never truly ended. The diner was no longer just a crime scene. It was a haunted space, a place where the veil between the world of the living and the ledger of the dead was terrifyingly thin. The spirits of the 19 victims, it is said, are forever tethered to the place of their violent end. They are the unseen patrons of a diner that no longer exists. Stories circulate of shadowy figures seen sitting in the phantom booths through the vacant window frames, their forms visible only for a moment in the sweep of a passing car's headlights. A local legend tells of a spectral salesman who appears on the road near the ruins, a man with a kind smile and a pearl-handled knife, forever trying to complete the journey he started so long ago. The ghosts of Maude's Eats are not vengeful spirits. They are quiet, sorrowful echoes, a permanent atmospheric stain of lives interrupted, their stories consumed and then forgotten, leaving only a lingering, palpable sense of loss that clings to the ruins like the prairie dust. Today, the skeletal remains of Maude's Eats have become a destination for a different kind of traveler, the dark tourist, the connoisseur of the grotesque. They come with their cameras and ghost hunting equipment, treating the sight of unimaginable suffering as a morbid amusement. Tour guides, often descendants of the families who stayed, recount the legend for a small fee, their voices flat and practiced as they point to the collapsed cellar. They end their speech with the same tired, chilling phrase, "Maude's meatloaf was so good, people said it was to die for." The horror has been commodified. The town's deep wound turned into a roadside attraction. It forces us to confront the final, unsettling question. When survival demands the unthinkable, does it create a monster, or does it merely reveal the one that was waiting inside us all along? The diner is a ruin, its secrets long since exhumed, but the story of Maude serves as a permanent archive of the darkness that can flourish in the soil of desperation. It is a chilling reminder that the most profound horrors are often hidden behind the most benevolent smiles, and that the line between hospitality and predation can be as thin as a butcher's knife. The voices of her 19 victims were silenced, their identities rendered down into a mere ingredient. To ensure that the darkest chapters of our history are never forgotten, and that the stories of the silenced are preserved against the decay of time, subscribe to our channel and help us keep the archives of the shadows open for all to see.